I mean, I think with teaching, which I'm still trying to figure out, like I kind of don't have a stable pedagogy. In fact, like one of the things I value about teaching writing is that you'd have to be crazy to think there was like one way to do it or one right way to do it, right? So like part of what I like about it is the adventure of trying to kind of like co-construct literary value each time. Like it starts over each time. And like what I want to do as a teacher is just like kind of honor what seemed to me to be the most exciting tendencies of a student's writing, and also just to read together, right? And to use someone else's work, not my work certainly, but not the student works either, right? As like an opportunity for an experiment in what values we can find in common, or to just kind of acknowledge where there's an irreconcilable difference of opinion. Because to me, part of the value of art, whether it's like reading together or looking at paintings together, is that way you have what feels like a very private experience. I mean, it is a very private experience, the way you encounter a text, how it resonates with you. But then there's the desire to make it social and to test what part of it is shareable with another person. And that's actually where writing and reading are so similar to me. Not just in the moment of writing or not just in the moment of reading, but in the desire then to talk about the experience, to turn it, to test what part of it might be shareable and what part of it might remain irreducibly private. So, I mean, I do, sometimes I have students who are only interested in kind of fragmentation, and then I will want to read things with them that are tremendously polished and full-throated and eloquent. Or sometimes I have students who are really good at a certain kind of discourse, and I want to read work that's full of felt silence with them or whatever. I mean, I think sometimes when you're a teacher, or you're a friend to any kind of writer, what you do is try to work against their most ingrained habit. I mean, the same way in which I'm constantly relying on my friends and interlocutors to kind of push me against my own my kind of default settings, right, as a writer. For me, it's often actually about the way, because I teach poetry, right? It's often about the way the student thinks of the line break, right? So if I have a student who, is always writing end-stopped lines, like the lines always end, with punctuation, or they always end at the kind of completion of a syntactic unit, then we might read Creeley, or we might read Alice Notley, or we might read Mark McMorris and think about this different attitude towards enjambment and the possibilities that are opened up by more unpredictability at the right margin, right? But similarly, if I have a student who only works with like a very kind of a lot of enjambment or a lot of fragmentation, we might like step back and read Whitman, or we might read a contemporary writer like Juliana Spar, or we might look at Claudia Rankine's kind of prose poems and say, well, what can the sentence do, right? Or Mamie Bersenbrugge's really long lines, like what does extension do? So in poetry, it's actually sometimes easier because than prose to find the counterexample, because you can kind of identify formal tendencies. And then, even on the level of someone uses a short line, let's read someone with a long line. But the same thing is true in fiction, right? Like, I mean, people who, if people are writing even really compelling, kind of short staccato sentences, like maybe it's nice then to read Woolf or James, or if a student's reading is really in the 20th century, it's like go back to another century. If it's really in an American context, read someone from somewhere else. It's just always about introducing a counter term to a certain degree, and not because the student needs to abandon the mode in which she's working, but because the student will actually get clearer about what tendencies are really irreducibly hers by virtue of being exposed to work that does something extremely different. I do have, it depends on the course. I mean, sometimes I teach courses that are really more literature courses, and we do have a really structured, syllabus. Although even then I try to make it participatory. Like I try to ask students to teach a work that I'm not familiar with, or the other students might not be familiar with. Or like right now, the course I'm about to teach, we're starting with this amazing book by Christina Sharp called In the Wake, which is a book kind of about, I mean, it has a lot to do with poetry. It's very involved with poetry, but it's a work about the history of white supremacy in America. And we kind of use it at the inception of the class so that everything we talk about afterwards is in the wake of In the Wake, right? It's very much about what it means to write and look at different media against the backdrop of the legacy of white supremacy in the U.S. It's not the only thing we do in the class, but it's an example of where there's a threshold. We read something in common at the beginning of the class, and then we have conversations about very different writing, including writing the students are bringing in the wake, right, of a certain kind of shared text. But it really depends on the class. And also, where I teach, there's a tutorial system, so there's always also one-on-one work with a student, and that tends to be, an unfolding conversation, which isn't just my saying, I have some kind of knowledge I want to impart to you, right? Which is not really something I do in a class. It's more about what kind of exchange can we develop, around a topic or a formal tendency that matters to you. It's a good question about what, especially at the graduate level, what students who are studying writing want out of it. And in fact, that's like a question I have for each student, right? I mean, it's like I teach poetry and not fiction. I think in fiction programs, there is a fantasy about making a living or getting a big advance or whatever. I mean, a good and bad thing about poetry is that fantasy doesn't even exist, So, but that also frees you from a certain kind of discourse of professionalization in the poetry classroom. No one's like talking about agents or stuff like that. But people need to figure out how to make a living, and I'm kind of always discouraging people from going into debt in order to, study poetry at the graduate level in the U.S. or whatever, because it doesn't confer any, it doesn't help you really figure out a way to make a living. But that also means that people who are there tend to be there, for a reason of a kind of passionate commitment to the art, even if that art is marginal relative to other, economic forces. So it's a side of possibility, and it's also a problem because people do need to figure out how to make a living. In the U.S. in particular, it's not a hospitable environment for people who are trying to work in the arts, But, I mean, related to that is, I think to a certain degree, what I like about teaching, what I like about talking to writers, why this crazy practice of reading and writing remains vital for me is that it's always a kind of experiment in unfolding a new language of value that isn't the dominant language of value of the day, right? It's not the dominant economic language of the day. It's experiment. It's shot through with all the economic contradictions of the moment and all the pressures, but it's also always an argument that some regime of value other than price, right, needs to be developed if we're going to stay human. So I sometimes think of poetry classes as little laboratories in value, but of course that takes place against the backdrop of people needing to make a living, and that's not something that the poetry classroom is very useful for. Yeah, I mean, I think I steal from my students all the time. It's just not, I steal a phrase, or I steal kind of energy, or I get something. I mean, I don't mean it to sound too vampiric. Like it's not stealing in the sense that I think their energy remains, but I definitely get something out of, right, seeing, I mean, especially as I kind of get older, as seeing the way these very different individuals are living language and imagining the art. So I get a kind of fund of energy from it. I also sometimes, I actually don't that often get to teach undergraduates, but the undergraduates where I teach at Brooklyn College are, it's just one of the most diverse undergraduate campuses in the world, which means there are many different language groups in a writing classroom, right? There are many different traditions. There are many different kinds of literacy, many different kinds of intelligence, and there's just no question that the echo chamber of that kind of classroom is incredibly propulsive and useful for me. I'm much more confident that I get something out of it than I am that they do.